Hey, today we're going to be taking a closer look at the Jobava London system with the move e6 from black. What that looks like is after d4, knight f6, knight c3, d5, bishop f4, e6. This is the most popular continuation for black against the Jobava London system. Our move in this position is e3, and the three moves we're going to be looking over today are bishop d6, bishop b4, and a6. Let us begin. So let's start with bishop b4 because I feel like it's the most forcing move and it's the simplest one to kind of understand. In response, we're going to simply play knight g to e2. Point being is if black decides to capture this knight, we can simply capture with our own knight and we're already much better. Once again, we have the prevalent knight b5 ideas with the c7 fork jump, and we're going to be much better in these sort of situations. It's very unlikely that they capture the c3 knight, and instead they might castle. Right now we're going to be following a game played by Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces, and he won this game in a very beautiful fashion, and so I think it's worthwhile to showcase all of these moves and sort of explain them. Magnus played a3, kicking his bishop out, forcing it to make a decision. So this bishop heads back to e7, and very funny, this knight goes back to g1. This is just a wild move to think about. Why bring out this knight to e2 if you're going to put it back on g1? But it makes a lot of sense when we break it down, actually. The point of knight g2 was to prepare this knight for recapture, but now that there's no threat of being captured, this knight can simply jump back to g1. Of course, if this bishop had moved to a4, the move b4 would have been possible. And after this bishop moved back, once again, the move knight g1 was very much a good option. So by placing the knight back on g1, it opens up this light square bishop. It also opens up the opportunity for this queen to jump out at any moment, but more importantly, it prepares knight to f3, which is where the knight belongs. The knight doesn't want to be on e2, where it doesn't really see anything. The knight wants to be on f3, where it's able to jump into e5 and so forth. So we get c5. This is a very thematic move in any d4 opening. c5 is used to challenge the center, and that's where you're going to see in 90% of the games where you play d4, and f3, and knight h5, attacking this bishop. Magnus does not care about that. He simply captures this pawn, and after a few trades, this structure for white looks a little bit wonky, but actually it's no big deal because our development is very simple in this position if we were playing white. And we have very clear way of attacking the king. So bishop d3 and g6. And g6 was sort of the first inaccuracy of the game. Black wanted to place as many pawns on the light squares as possible in order to neutralize his bishop. But in turn, this created holes around the dark squares and made Black's king more vulnerable than it was before. So right away, Magnus started a attack by launching h4. This prepares h5. The opponent responds with knight c6, which is once again a mistake. The much better move was h5, and from there, actually right away, there was this g4 move, which is very thematic for the Jobava London system. Point being is that this capture can never occur because white will be a lot better after the move knight e5. Now the only way to protect this pawn is with f5, and after that you can capture this pawn on g6 and be very much fine. Or you can even sacrifice the knight and go for something like this, where after, let's say, queen f6, you capture this g6 pawn. And the longer you let the engine look at this, the more the engine likes the position for white. But it's very unlikely that somebody plays f5. I know I wouldn't play f5. This looks like a very odd move because it allows the capture of g6. I mean, I wouldn't even look at knight takes g4, but yeah, even that is an option. Shows you how diverse and full of tactics the Jobava London system is. But let's say your opponent plays something more natural, such as knight c6. In this case, you can simply capture with the pawn on g4, and you can actually castle queenside here, sacrificing a pawn, because after these captures, you can actually even use a waiting move to just play king b1, slide the king over, and then play h5, and black really doesn't have anything to stop you here. If g5, which is one of the only moves, I don't really see what else black can play. Obviously, black cannot capture this pawn because it's pinned to the king, but let's say just bishop d7, for example. Then there is h takes g6, rook h6, and now this is not defendable. This is absolutely losing for black. I'm going to show you guys an example line of what that would kind of look like. For example, rook f4, queen takes g6, the queen slides over to protect, and knight takes d5, sacrifice, which is absolutely insane. If the knight gets captured with the pawn, you simply go over there, attacking all of these pieces with the queen. After rook blocks, for example, you have bishop h7 check, which is forcing to lose the queen. Obviously, black is completely lost and ready to resign in that position. And if something like, I don't know, rook f7, you just simply play rook g6, trade all of these pieces off, and you're up an exchange, you're up a queen, should be good there. Now, of course, the probability that you get this exact variation is 0. However, I think it's still worth mentioning just to showcase the sort of ideas that you might encounter and the way you can completely punish your opponent for misplaying a singular move. After h5 and g5, you can play h6, And after something natural like bishop d7, once again, sacrificing the knight. If the pawn recaptures, you can take the bishop, so you just won your pawn back. But now you have an insane initiative. All of your pieces are harmonically placed together. I don't know if that's the right word, but and you have extreme activity. This h-pawn is extremely strong. You should be winning these games. And of course, if the queen recaptures, you simply have bishop h7 check, and black gives up the queen. So either way, you should be completely fine in that position. Now, what we encountered in the game was different. We got knight c6 from black, which allowed h5 for white, and this is a huge, huge step forward for white. White is better in this position. If you allow white to play h5 in a position where black is castle kingside, pretty much white's going to be better in almost all of these positions. Queen f6 and queen d2. Queen e2 just protects his pawn on f4. It also opens up the opportunity for an eventual, let's say, f5 push and potentially putting the queen on h6. That is always an opportunity. And then we got e5, which was just a blunder. I mean, at this point, the game really kind of ended because knight takes d5 is, with tempo on the queen. And from there, this isn't really relevant to our study. If black did not blunder with a move e5, there could have been bishop d7, for example, castling queenside. And after something like rook d8, you could play knight g5 and prepare a huge attack. Obviously, your pieces are better placed in this position, and black's king is in a lot of danger. I won't bore you with, 20 moves of what could potentially happen because this position hasn't ever been reached. That, however, summarizes the move bishop b4. So, as I said, there isn't, a ton of theory in the Jobava London. It's just more important to understand the ideas, and I hope that the game I showcase, as well as the variations, illustrated those ideas. One thing to always keep in mind is that if your opponent plays e6 and brings the bishop out, that usually means that they're going to be castling kingside. In which case, it's better for us to castle queenside in all of these positions. Even though that the engine sometimes recommends castling kingside, I would say that white is almost always doing better when they've castled queenside because it allows for the eventual g4, g5, h4, h5, h6 pushes, which are just simply not possible if your king is castled kingside, because then your king is exposed and very much vulnerable. But specifically for bishop b4, just remember this knight e2 jump, and you should be fine from there. By the way, if you found this video useful so far, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps my channel out a ton, and it will help you stay notified when future videos come out. Thank you. Now let's take a look at bishop d6. So you play knight f3 in response to bishop d6. Bishop d6 is inferior to bishop b4. It already gives white a slight advantage. A couple of interesting things to know here is if this bishop capture ever occurs, you simply recapture with the pawn. And it might seem a little bit awkward, but actually your knight is very absurdly strong on e5. And then you can continue with g4 and g5, or even f5 in some variations, trying to do the same to black structure in order to break it apart. And honestly, in this position, there's nothing to be worried about. Black is almost always going to be a little bit worse, and you're going to have a very small yet stable advantage. An example of what that might look like is 95 right away. And if you see c5, which is a very challenging move, obviously trying to take away from this pawn center that is very strong, that supports e5, you can actually just simply take this pawn. There's no dark square bishop, so black's going to have to spend the tempo in order to get this pawn in its sights. For example, queen e7 is a move. Here you can play queen f3. You don't need to worry about protecting the pawn because black can spend an entire additional tempo trying to recapture it. You can castle queenside and then c6, bishop d3, bringing the pieces into the game, creating an attack. If this knight ever captures our knight, you can recapture the e-pawn. Let's say 97. There's a very nice move with the queen going to h3, preparing this checkmate threat. Of course, if this pawn gets captured, you simply mate your opponent in one. And if something like h6, well, you just play f4. Simply play f4, and in that position you are much better because you're going to continue with g4, g5, rook g1 maybe, and you should be good. So that covers what happens if your opponent takes his bishop. If your opponent just castles and plays very just calmly, you can put this bishop on d3. You can then reroute this bishop to g5. This bishop on g5 is a little bit better than on f4. If your opponent decided to not trade it off, then why keep it on f4? It doesn't really serve much purpose there. You're never going to take this bishop because that's just going to help your opponent activate more pieces. So instead, why not pin this knight to the queen? Here we encounter the first mistake made in the game with the move b6. The real purpose of that is just to bring this bishop out because this bishop is very much restrained behind these pawns. But in reality, the bishop is just as restrained on b7 as it is on c8. A much better move would have been, knight b4, preparing to take this bishop and make this game a very equal, very close game with equal chances. But after b6, simply a3, preventing knight b4 or bishop coming out to b4 ever, and white is better here. And after bishop b7, we had queen e2, bishop slid back, and h4. This prepares h5, h6. Black plays knight a5. This prepares c5. It also prepares the move knight c4 eventually. After c5 and let's say some trades occur, maybe a rook on c8, this knight can slide over to c4 and be a very strong knight from that position. e4. Slight mistake. I would say that castling queenside would have been a little bit better, a little more solid, and there was no need to immediately push e4. But this is fine. You know, white maintains a slight advantage. And after all of these trades have occurred, the game is pretty much equal. And the rest of the game does not really matter, once again, to our study. In fact, it was won very quickly by white. After all of these moves have occurred, simply a4 was the game-ending move. In this position, black resigned because a5 and a6 was unstoppable, and this knight is completely trapped. There's no way of saving the knight. And this rook is also very much stuck on f5. There really aren't many things that black can do in this position. Very much neutralized the opponent. Regardless, I felt like the first half of this game was an amazing illustration of how you're supposed to deal with these sort of setups with the bishop on d6. From here, you're really white could have just castled queenside and been completely fine. After c5, white probably should have played something like bishop a6, traded this bishop off if possible, because you know there was always a risk of the bishop getting trapped or entangled in a very nasty position with the move c4. So bishop a6, and then from there, you know, 95, g4, h5, h6. Trade this knight off, bring this queen out, rook g1 maybe, or just continue with the rook on h1. And that position would have been very pleasant for white. Could have led to a very nice win. It still led to a very nice win, just slightly differently. But with this sort of play, it would have been more in the style of the Jobava London. That summarizes bishop d6. Just remember knight f3, very simple move. Bishop d3, queen e2, or queen d2 sometimes is also okay. Castle queenside. You can always play a3. This stops knight b4 jumps. Knight b4 jumps can be very annoying, so if you play bishop d3, a lot of the time it's very useful to have either a3 before that, or just to make sure you play a3 on the next move in order to prevent knight b4, because they can be annoying sometimes. But I mean, even if you allow them, the game is going to be very much equal with equal fighting chances. However, you know, keeping the light square bishop is usually a good thing in these positions because it's so powerful when it stares down this h7 pawn. Incredibly powerful bishop. And yeah, that pretty much summarizes all of the ideas I wanted to show you with this bishop d6 line. Last but not least, let's talk about a6. So the point of a6 is to prevent the move knight b5, which is one of the main ideas in the Jobava London system. Knight b5, which prepares knight c7 check, forking the king and rook. That just prevents that completely. It also prepares the move b5 for black themselves, because black acknowledges that in most of these positions, we're going to be castling queenside. And in that case, expanding on the queenside is always going to be a pleasant idea. I've chosen a move that a lot of grandmasters have been playing in recent years, and it's a very hyper modern move, very 21st century chess type of move, and it's the move g4. Immediately trying to kick this knight out with g5. There's so many options for black here. I mean, it's impossible to study everything, so it's more important to understand the ideas. For example, if c5, you get g5 kicking this knight out, and from there you're going to simply play knight f3 and continue the game from there. Something like a3, you might get b5. You're gonna just simply develop normally as you would. You're gonna still castle queenside, and then you can continue with h4, h5, h6. You can even play knight e5, for example, in certain variations, and then while keeping your queen on d1, this will allow you to bring the queen out to g4 or h5 even, and create some sort of masterful attack from there. That's really all I have to say about the move c5. It's not really scary. Just remember you can kick this knight out and then develop normally as you would. Pretty much all of the attacks and sort of ideas are similar to the bishop d6 and bishop b4 line that we already discussed. However, there is one thing I have to mention about this a6 line, and it's that after the move g4, there is this very annoying bishop b4 move. You have to play knight g2. This is the engine's recommendation, and this is pretty much the only move you have that maintains a sort of equal position for white. And what you might notice is now that this g4 pawn is hanging. So after this capture, you play rook g1. If this knight goes back, you are better because you capture this g7 pawn. After something like knight h5, you can just drop back to g1 and then recapture the knight. Here you're not worried about this bishop capturing the knight because b takes c3, you have the very quick c4 to follow up with and chip away at black center, and you're still going to maintain a c-pawn. So that's definitely better for white than it is for black. There is also a line here after the rook g1 with the move g5. In this case, you simply capture this knight, and we get pretty much the same exact thing. Of course, if this bishop captures, b takes c3, very much fine for white. You can set up, the move c4 by playing queen d2. You also open up the b file, which is very good for your rook. You can put the rook on b1, and in this position, I highly doubt you're going to be castling anywhere. If anything, your king is much safer in the center, and you're just going to employ the same ideas we've already discussed. So c4, you can expand with h4, h5, h6 if you really want to, queen d2, and just activate your pieces. This position is better for white than it is for black. Play these games. You will be winning in this position. Your advantage lies in the fact that you have more piece activity, and also that you can easily break away from black center by playing the move c4 at a certain point. It's something that's going to happen anyway. And so use that to your advantage. You will be fine in these positions. You will be winning these games, and you've really got nothing to worry about. Ladies and gentlemen, this summarizes everything I wanted to show you for this e6 line for black. I hope you guys found this very much useful, and if you did, please consider checking out a video to my left. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.